And then there was an investigation, toxic work environment at our show. I learned that things happened here that never should have happened. Sometimes I get sad, I get mad, I get anxious, I get frustrated, I get impatient. I'm working on all of that.
For 14 seasons, Marla Winters stood at center stage of The Marla Show and told her studio audience the same thing. Every single afternoon, choose kindness. It became more than a sign-off. It became a logo, a merchandise line, a hashtag, and eventually, the entire foundation of a media empire built on the idea that Marla Winters was the nicest person on television. Nobody watching at home knew that 3 floors above the studio, in a windowless office lined with framed magazine covers, a very different version of kindness was being enforced by the people who actually ran the show. Marla's rise had been unlikely and, for a long time, genuinely inspiring. She'd started in small comedy clubs in her 20s, opening for acts nobody remembers now, sleeping in her car more nights than she liked to admit in later interviews. She'd been rejected by network after network, too weird, too soft, not enough of a hook, one executive reportedly told her before hanging up. She finally found an audience by being disarmingly honest on camera, self-deprecating, a little goofy, willing to dance badly in the aisles if it made people laugh. When the show finally launched, in a cramped studio with a skeleton crew and a budget that barely covered the lighting rig, it worked because it felt unscripted, even though almost none of it actually was. By season 6, The Marla Show was a machine. A media conglomerate called Halcyon Media owned the distribution rights and syndicated the show to over 200 markets, translating it into 11 languages for international syndication deals that generated more revenue than the domestic broadcast itself. Consumer brands lined up months in advance to sponsor the show's famous giveaway segments: cars, vacations, life-changing checks handed to weeping audience members while confetti cannons fired, and the studio band played a triumphant 4-bar sting that had, by season 8, become as recognizable as the theme song. Every giveaway was, on paper, a marketing partnership. The brand got airtime and a halo effect, Halcyon got ad revenue and ratings, and Marla got credit for changing someone's life on camera. It was a good arrangement for almost everyone involved, and it made Marla one of the wealthiest entertainers in the country, with a production deal, a lifestyle magazine, and a motivational book that sold 4 million copies, despite the fact that Marla had dictated maybe 30 minutes of material to a ghostwriter over lunch. The tagline appeared on coffee mugs, tote bags, throw pillows, and eventually a line of children's pajamas. Halcyon's marketing division ran an internal metric they called Kindness Recall, a quarterly survey measuring how strongly audiences associated the word kind with Marla's name versus any other public figure. For 6 straight years, she topped the list. Part 2. The office upstairs. The staff who worked on the show rarely saw Marla outside of taped segments. She arrived through a private entrance, was walked directly to hair and makeup by her personal assistant, taped for 3 hours, and left. Most of the day-to-day instructions staff received came from her longtime head producer, a man named Denny Pruitt, who had been with the show since its 2nd season and who ran the writer's room and production floor with a reputation that staff only discussed in whispers, usually after they'd already quit and had nothing left to lose. New hires were given an informal but very clear rule during onboarding, delivered by a mid-level manager with a practiced, almost bored cadence as though she'd said it 100 times before because she had. If you saw Marla in the hallway, you nodded. You didn't speak first, and under no circumstances did you bring her a problem directly. Problems went through Denny. Denny decided what Marla needed to know and what she didn't. A production assistant named Rosa Delgato learned this the hard way in her 2nd month. Her father had died unexpectedly, and she'd taken 4 days off for the funeral, unpaid, because she hadn't yet accrued leave. She flew out on a Wednesday night, sat through a viewing on Thursday, a funeral mass on Friday, and flew back Sunday red-eyed and exhausted, expecting to walk back into the same chaotic, high-energy production floor she'd left. When she came back Monday morning, her badge no longer worked at the security door. She stood there for a full minute, swiping it twice, assuming it was a technical glitch, before a security guard she didn't recognize came over and told her, not unkindly, that he'd need to see her escorted upstairs. Denny's assistant met her in a small conference room and told her, without much ceremony, that her position had been restructured during her absence. There was a folder on the table with a severance agreement already printed and highlighted in the places she needed to sign. Rosa never got a chance to explain that she'd told her direct supervisor about the funeral 2 weeks in advance. In writing, she never found out whether Marla even knew her name. Rosa wasn't alone. Over the years, a pattern quietly formed. Employees who asked for accommodations, raised concerns about scheduling, or pushed back on demeaning treatment from senior producers tended not to last long. A wardrobe assistant who complained about being screamed at during a live taping was gone within the month. A junior writer who suggested cutting a joke he felt targeted a guest's accent was told, by Denny personally, that he didn't understand the show. He was gone by the following Friday. There was an unofficial term for it among longtime staff, passed quietly from one new hire to the next during the first smoke break or coffee run where nobody from management could overhear, getting restructured. It became a kind of dark shorthand. When someone's badge stopped working or their name disappeared from the call sheet without explanation, staff didn't ask what happened. They just said the person had gotten restructured, the way you might say someone had caught a cold, an unfortunate, faintly embarrassing thing that happened to people. Best not dwelt on too long, lest it happen to you next. Denny himself was, by most accounts, not a cartoonish villain in the moment-to-moment sense. He remembered people's birthdays. He could be genuinely funny in the writer's room and generous with credit when a joke of his landed because someone junior had planted the seed. That was, in its own way, what made the culture so hard to describe to outsiders later. It wasn't constant, visible cruelty. It was inconsistency, unpredictability, the sense that the ground could shift under you for reasons that were never fully explained, administered by someone who could also, on a good day, be perfectly pleasant. Staff learned to read his moods the way sailors read weather and to plan their requests, their bad days, their emergencies, around whichever version of him happened to be in the building that week. Everyone who left signed paperwork on the way out. Buried in most of those agreements was a clause that said, in dense legal language, that the departing employee would not discuss the terms of their departure or the internal operations of the show with any member of the media, under penalty of forfeiting the severance itself and exposure to further legal action. For years, that clause did exactly what it was designed to do. It kept things quiet, one exit interview at a time. Outside that system entirely was a comedian named Reggie Voss, who had spent 2 decades building an audience the hard way. Small clubs, then mid-sized theaters, then arenas. Entirely independent of any network's approval. Reggie didn't need Halcyon Media, and Halcyon Media had no leverage over him, which meant that when he had opinions about the entertainment industry, he said them loudly from the stage, with no publicist vetting the material beforehand. For years, Reggie had a bit about what he called kindness influencers, famous people, he said, who'd turned basic decency into a licensing opportunity. You don't need a foundation to hold a door open, he'd say, pacing the stage, building the rhythm the way he always did before the punchline landed. You don't need a hashtag to not be cruel to a waiter. Somewhere out there, somebody's getting a merchandising check for saying "be nice" on television. And somewhere underneath that same building, somebody just got fired for taking a sick day. He never named Marla specifically. He didn't have to. Clips of the bits circulated online for years, ripped from grainy phone footage in the front row, gaining a slow, steady following among people who worked in the industry and recognized exactly who he was talking about, even if the tabloids never printed it outright. Reggie's larger point, repeated across a dozen interviews over the years on podcasts, in late-night green rooms, once memorably during a radio interview that went viral for entirely different reasons, was structural rather than personal. Major entertainment companies, he argued, build their biggest stars into financial assets. And once someone becomes valuable enough, an entire legal and PR apparatus exists specifically to protect that value, sometimes at the direct expense of the people working underneath them. It's not that these companies are uniquely evil, he said in one interview. It's that protecting a $100 million brand is somebody's actual job description. Protecting Rosa from accounting isn't anybody's job. That's the whole thing right there. Industry insiders sometimes pushed back, off the record, arguing that Reggie was oversimplifying a business that also created a lot of legitimate jobs and, at its best, real audience joy. Reggie's answer to that, when it came up, was usually some version of the same line. "I'm not saying burn it down. I'm saying stop pretending the machine and a message are the same thing." At the other end of the spectrum from both Marla and Reggie was an actor named Julian Marsh, known mostly for a long-running action franchise called Nightfall, and for being, by every account from people who'd actually worked with him, almost aggressively normal. Julian didn't do lifestyle brand deals. He didn't have a wellness line, a fragrance, or a memoir. When journalists asked about his charitable giving, he tended to deflect the question entirely, changing the subject with a half-joke, which only made people more curious over time. It eventually came out not through a press release, but through a hospital administrator who mentioned it almost in passing during an unrelated local news interview about a new wing opening that Julian had been quietly funding a children's oncology unit for 6 years through a foundation that didn't carry his name at all. He'd specifically asked, in writing, that the funding not be publicized, and for a while it wasn't. When it did leak, a dozen outlets scrambled for comment, and Julian gave exactly one short statement, read by his publicist rather than delivered on camera. "It's not about me. I'd rather you write about the kids." He declined every follow-up request for the next 3 years. And eventually reporters mostly stopped asking. On set, stories about him were consistent in a way that Marla's stories, once they started coming out, were not. He learned the names of camera operators within the first week of any shoot and used them. He tipped stunt performers out of his own pocket, above and beyond what the studio paid, a habit that had reportedly started on his second film after he watched a stunt double take a fall that could easily have broken something and realized the man was making less in a year than Julian made in a single day of reshoots, when a director once offered him a significant salary bump to trim a supporting actor's role in order to give Julian more screen time. He turned the money down flat and told the studio, according to someone in the room at the time, that the scene stayed as written or he wasn't coming back for the sequel. None of this made Julian a saint, and he'd have been the first to say so on the rare occasions anyone got him to talk about it at all. But it was, by every account, consistent on camera and off. Whether anyone was watching or not, whether there was a camera crew present to capture it, or just a hospital administrator who happened to mention it years later without realizing it would become a story. The two worlds collided, briefly, when Julian appeared on The Marla Show to promote the third Nightfall film. It was a routine stop, one of a dozen he'd do that month across a punishing press tour. On stage, Marla kept the segment moving with her usual rhythm quick jokes, rapid-fire questions, a pre-taped clip designed specifically to get a reaction, queued up by a producer standing just off camera, holding up 2 fingers to signal it was coming. The clip was an old interview with a former co-star, a woman named Denise Okafor, who'd worked with Julian a decade earlier on a much smaller film. In it, Denise admitted, laughing, that she'd had a crush on him the entire shoot. The studio audience laughed and applauded on cue. Marla turned back to Julian with a grin, clearly expecting him to play along, to riff, to give the segment the kind of moment that would clip well online. Julian just smiled a little and said, evenly, "Denise is one of the best actors I've ever worked with. We had a lot of long days on that set, and we kept it professional, because that's the job." He didn't elaborate. He didn't perform embarrassment or deny it or turn it into a bit. Marla pushed once more, angling for something bigger, and he gently redirected the conversation to a question about the stunt work in the new film instead, without ever seeming rude about it. At the time, nobody thought much of it. It was 7 minutes of daytime television, forgotten by most viewers before the next commercial break. The segment aired, performed reasonably in the ratings, and the clip got a modest bump online for a day or two before disappearing into the archive along with thousands of other interviews. It took years for the cracks in the Marla Show to become visible from the outside, but inside the building, they'd been forming for a long time. A wardrobe department that had once had 6 full-time staffers was down to 2, with the difference quietly absorbed by unpaid overtime. A researcher named Priyanka Osei, who had worked on the show for 5 years, began keeping a private notebook dates, names, small incidents, nothing dramatic on its own, but a pattern when read together. She didn't know what she'd ever do with it. She just didn't want to be the only one who remembered. A journalist named Priya Anand, working for an independent digital outlet, with no financial ties to Halcyon Media and no advertisers to protect, had been hearing rumors about the show for over a year, mostly secondhand, mostly unconfirmed. She began quietly reaching out to former Marla show staff, promising anonymity and meaning it. The first few interviews were cautious, guarded, full of long pauses and half-finished sentences. Priya didn't push. She just kept showing up, kept following up gently, kept being consistent in a way that, after a while, made people trust her. Then one former staffer connected her to another. Then that person connected her to Priyanka Osei, whose notebook turned 5 vague years of institutional memory into a set of specific, dated, corroborating details. Then more people came forward on their own, having heard through a loosely connected network of former employees that someone was finally listening. Each new account gave Priya just enough corroborating detail that the pattern became impossible to dismiss as a handful of disgruntled ex-employees with an axe to grind. Part 7. The Unraveling. By the time Priya's investigation published, under the headline Behind the Kindness, What Former Staffers Say Really Happened at the Marla Show, it included accounts from 31 former staffers, several speaking on the record for the first time despite the NDAs they'd signed, having concluded after consulting lawyers of their own that the collective weight of the story mattered more than the individual risk. Within a week, Halcyon Media announced an internal review, retaining an outside employment law firm to interview current and former staff. Within a month, Denny Pruitt and 2 other senior producers had been quietly removed from the show, with a brief internal memo citing leadership changes and nothing more specific. Marla, facing a studio audience for the first time since the story broke, opened with a monologue that had clearly been drafted and redrafted by a team of crisis communications specialists, apologizing for what she said she hadn't known was happening under her name and promising an overhaul of the show's internal culture. It wasn't enough. Viewers who had spent years buying Choose Kindness mugs now scrutinized every clip of the